Grief is a strange architect. For David, it was a blueprint of dust motes dancing in the final rays of sun through his late mother's windows. Renovating the old house was meant to be a final act of closure, a practical project of sanding floors and replacing fixtures to erase the lingering scent of sickness and eccentricity. He believed in solid foundations and logical conclusions, things he could measure with a tape and level. But the house had its own blueprints, etched not in paper, but in silence and secrets. He thought he was fixing a house. He was about to discover he was disturbing a home. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The air in his mother's house was a physical weight, thick with the scent of potpourri, old paper, and the faint, cloying sweetness of decay that clings to places where a long life has ended. For 2 weeks, David had been methodically dismantling the life of Eleanor Harris, a woman he loved but had never fully understood. He was an architect, a man who saw the world in clean lines and calculated stress loads. His mother had seen it in almonds, whispers, and the subtle moods of the rambling old house she had refused to ever leave. He'd started in the living room, boxing up porcelain birds and yellowed paperbacks. Now he was on the second floor, the emotional high ground. This was where her personality was most potent. Her bedroom, still smelling of lavender and mothballs, was a fortress of anxieties. He found bags of salt tucked into closet corners and strange geometric symbols drawn in chalk on the backs of paintings. For protection, she had always said with a tight, knowing smile that frustrated him to no end. He'd loved her, but her eccentricities had built a wall between them just as surely as the lath and plaster of the house itself. The house, at least, was solid. Built by his great-grandfather, it had what contractors called good bones. The foundation was stone, the frame oak. It had weathered a century of New England storms without so much as a shudder. Selling it was the logical choice. He had his own life, his own career, 3 states away. Still, every pried-up floorboard and filled-in nail hole felt like a small betrayal. It was on the 3rd night of the 2nd week that he first heard it. The sun had long set, leaving the surrounding woods in an impenetrable blackness. The only sounds were the hum of his work light and the mournful hoot of a distant owl. He was rolling a coat of primer onto the hallway wall when he paused to dip his roller. Scratch, scratch, scrape. It was faint, almost imperceptible, coming from inside the wall to his left, the wall that separated the hallway from the attic. He straightened up, head tilted, listening. It stopped. David snorted, a small cloud of condensation in the chilly air. Squirrels, or maybe a raccoon that had found a loose soffit. It was an old house in a wooded area. Pests were part of the package. Annoying, but normal. He'd deal with it tomorrow. He finished the wall, the rhythmic roll of his tool a comforting, logical sound that easily drowned out the memory of the other. The next day, he dedicated the morning to pest control. He climbed the pull-down stairs into the main section of the attic, a vast, dusty space smelling of ancient cedar and mouse droppings. He saw no nests, no droppings larger than a pellet, no signs of entry. The insulation was old but undisturbed. Still, he was thorough. He set 2 large Havahart traps near the eaves, baiting them with peanut butter. Outside, he did a full circuit of the house, checking the siding, the roofline, the foundation. He found nothing. No holes, no chewed-through fascia boards. The house was sealed tight. Strange, he thought, but his logical mind supplied an answer. They must have gotten in and been trapped for a while. The traps would get them. That night, he worked on the downstairs bathroom, tiling the floor with precise, satisfying clicks. He almost forgot about the noise until he went upstairs to sleep. As he passed the hallway, he paused, listening. Silence. A small, triumphant smile touched his lips. Maybe his presence had scared them off. He was just drifting off to sleep when it started again. Scratch, scratch, scrape. It was in the same spot, a little louder this time, perhaps, or was that just his imagination, amplified by the silence of the night? He sighed, rolling over and pulling a pillow over his head. Annoying, yes, but just an animal. The traps would do their job. He fell asleep, dreaming of blueprints where the dimensions kept changing on their own. The next morning, he checked the traps in the attic. They were empty, the peanut butter untouched. For 3 more nights, the cycle repeated. Empty traps in the morning, the persistent scratch, scratch, scrape at night. David's frustration began to curdle into a low-grade unease. The sound was changing. It wasn't the frantic, random scrabbling of a trapped animal. It was measured, rhythmic. It had a cadence. He started timing it. 10 seconds of scratching, 5 seconds of silence. Repeat. It was too consistent for a pest. The inciting incident happened on a Saturday night. He was exhausted, his patience worn thin. The scratching had started the moment he'd turned off his music downstairs. It felt deliberate, a challenge. On a whim, born of irritation, he walked up to the hallway wall and tapped it 3 times with his knuckle. Tap, tap, tap. The scratching on the other side stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. David held his breath. Then, from within the wall, came a reply. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was drier, a rasping knock, but the rhythm was perfect. A cold knot formed in David's stomach. He stared at the smooth, newly primed wall. This wasn't a squirrel. Squirrels didn't mock you. He tapped again, a more complex rhythm this time. Tap, tap, tap. A pause, then the reply, perfectly mimicked. Scrape, 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 scrape. He backed away from the wall, a profound sense of wrongness washing over him. His logical mind scrambled for an explanation, an acoustic anomaly, a pipe settling, anything. But he knew what he had heard. It was intelligent, reactive. Later that night, in a desperate attempt to drown it out, he put a Bluetooth speaker in the hallway and played a fast-paced electronic track. Incredibly, impossibly, the scratching from the wall seemed to speed up, its scrapes and taps falling into a bizarre, grotesque percussion with the beat. His focus now shifted entirely to the source. The attic was bisected by a wall that wasn't on the original house blueprints he'd found in the study. It was made of newer plasterboard, smooth and featureless, starkly different from the rough horsehair plaster of the rest of the house. There was no door, no access panel. It sealed off the entire front portion of the attic above the eaves. He remembered now, with a jolt, his mother's uncharacteristic sternness about that specific wall. Years ago, when he'd offered to build her some attic storage, she'd grabbed his arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. No, David, that wall is load-bearing. It must never, ever be touched. You understand me? Never. It made no sense. He was an architect. He knew a load-bearing wall when he saw one, and this thin plasterboard partition wasn't it. It was a lie, a strange, desperate lie. He had to talk to someone. He called his sister Chloe, who lived in Oregon. He tried to keep his voice even, casual, but the words tumbled out, colored with a frantic edge he couldn't hide. "There's something in the walls, Chloe, and it's weird." He described the rhythmic scratching, the mocking taps. He expected concern, maybe even a shared sense of unease. What he got was a weary sigh. "Oh, Dave," she said, her voice full of a familiar, pitying affection. "You know how Mom was. She was paranoid about that house. Remember the bad air in the basement or the sad corner in the dining room? She probably heard a mouse fart 20 years ago and sealed off half the attic herself. It's just a big raccoon, I promise. A smart one, maybe. Just call an exterminator and have them knock the wall down if they have to. Put it out of its misery and yours." He hung up the phone feeling more isolated than ever. A big raccoon. He looked at the wall, at the place where his mother had forbidden him to go. A big raccoon didn't explain the cold dread that was now a permanent resident in his chest. The exterminator was a man named Gary, whose confidence was as thick as his mustache. He arrived with thermal imagers, acoustic sensors, and a truck full of chemicals. He radiated a professional certainty that David found immensely comforting. The comfort didn't last. Gary spent an hour scanning the wall, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing minute. "Well, you ain't crazy," he finally conceded, pulling the thermal camera from his face. "There's something in there all right, and it's big." He showed David the screen. A large, vaguely oblong shape was visible in the void. It was the size of a large dog, maybe bigger. But the disturbing part wasn't the size. It was the color. Instead of the warm, bright orange of a living creature, the shape was a deep, unsettling blue. It was cold, colder than the surrounding wall, colder than the rest of the unheated attic. "Never seen a signature like that," Gary muttered, scratching his head. "And this is the other thing." He put a sensitive microphone against the plaster. "It's dead silent now, like it knows we're here. We've been making a racket for an hour and not a peep." He rapped his knuckles on the wall. Nothing. Gary admitted he was stumped. "Look, Mr. Harris, I can in good conscience charge you for a job I don't know how to do. Whatever that is, it ain't a normal pest. It ain't a raccoon, it ain't a possum, it ain't a squatter. I don't know what the hell it is, but my advice? Get a contractor, not an exterminator. Tear the wall down and see what you've got." The exterminator, the man of science and poison, packed up his gear and left, casting a nervous glance back at the house as he drove away. The professional's failure shattered David's last bastion of denial. This was not normal. Frustrated and increasingly terrified, he decided to search for the original house deeds, hoping for a more detailed blueprint that might explain the walled-off section. He went to his mother's old roll-top desk, a place he'd been avoiding. As he rummaged through brittle folders of tax returns and property records, his fingers brushed against a false bottom at the back of a deep drawer. Prying it open, he found not deeds, but a stack of leather-bound journals tied with a faded ribbon. He opened the first one. His mother's familiar, spidery handwriting filled the page. What he had always dismissed as paranoid delusions, the ramblings of a lonely, eccentric woman, now read as a terrifying instruction manual for the house he was standing in. October 12, 1985. The scratching is calm tonight. A good sign. Father always said it sings the song of the house's health. He called it the keeper. It was here before the house was. When great-grandfather Harris laid the foundation stones, he found it sleeping in the earth. A chthonic thing, ancient and deep. They were afraid, but they were also practical men. Instead of dynamiting the bedrock and angering it, they made a pact, a strange, silent communion. They built the house around it, the hollow spaces between the walls, the dark expanse of the attic. They didn't build a house, they built a shell, a burrow. In exchange for this shelter, for the constant, quiet vibration of a family living and breathing around it, it would keep the house safe. It perceives our heartbeats, our footsteps, as a form of companionship. The scratching is its song, its way of saying, "I am here, all is well." David's hands trembled as he turned the pages. His mother wasn't mentally ill. She had been a warden. May 3, 1991. David brought Frada for a sleepover. The boys were running and screaming in the upstairs hall. The keeper grew agitated. The scratching became a frantic drumming. The lights flickered all night. I had to explain that the house had faulty wiring. The truth is, the keeper despises loud, chaotic disruptions. It sees them as a threat to the integrity of its shell. It is not evil. It is territorial. It is the soul of the house, a physical, biological soul. And we, the Harris line, are its heartbeat. He feverishly flipped through the volumes, years of his life recontextualized into a secret horror. His childhood stomach bugs after particularly loud birthday parties. Her mother's insistence on quiet time every evening. Her panic when a storm knocked a tree onto the roof. She wasn't worried about the damage. She was worried about the creature's terror. He finally found the last journal with entries from only a few years ago. July 22, 2018. I am growing tired. The house feels it. The keeper's song is slower these days, more questioning. What will happen when my vibration ceases? A house that falls silent is a broken pact. An empty house is a tomb. I fear for what will happen when I am gone. I fear for David, who only sees wood and nails and does not hear the song. Reading the journals was like having a lifetime of memories surgically rewired. Every oddity, every strange rule his mother had imposed now clicked into place with horrifying clarity. He was not just renovating a house, he was desecrating a holy site, violating a pact that was over a century old. The journals laid out the rules with chilling precision. The family must provide quiet companionship. The low hum of a refrigerator, the soft tread of footsteps, the murmur of conversation, these were the vibrations of the symbiotic relationship. They must never breach the inner walls of its nest, and most crucially, the house must never fall silent or empty for too long. His mother's death was the first violation. The weeks the house sat empty and silent, cold and still, must have been a terrifying sensory deprivation for the creature. His arrival, with the roar of sanders, the percussive blast of a nail gun, and the jarring crash of demolition, was the second, more egregious violation. The responsive tapping wasn't a mocking game. It was an agitated warning from a blind, terrified landlord whose world was being torn apart. Eleanor's journals described what little her own parents had passed down about the creature's nature. It was blind, ancient, and its form was wrong. She wrote of a glimpse her grandfather had caught once during a roof repair. He saw only a part of it, a leg or an arm, he said. Too many joints, the color of pale earth and the texture of old wood. It is not a spirit, not a ghost. It is a thing of flesh and chitin, a biological impossibility sleeping in the heart of our home. The walled-off section of the attic, the one he had tapped on, was its primary nesting chamber, its sanctum. With this new, terrible knowledge, the sounds of his own work became a source of torment. The whine of the orbital sander on the pine floors of the bedroom felt like an assault. He could almost feel the vibrations traveling through the joists, into the walls, directly into the creature's nest. In response, the scratching became a furious, aggressive frenzy. It was no longer rhythmic. It was a chaotic scratching and clawing, the sound of a massive thing trying to tear its way through the plaster. Then came new sounds, deep, guttural clicks from within the wall, like 1,000 giant insects chittering in unison. A low, resonant hissing that seemed to pressurize the air in the hallway. He began to feel the entity's rage. The floorboards would vibrate when he walked past the wall, a low thrumming that resonated in the bones of his feet. One afternoon, as he was hammering a loose cabinet in the kitchen, a row of his mother's porcelain birds vibrated off a shelf on the other side of the room and shattered on the floor. The keeper was enraged. The loud, chaotic sounds of the renovation were not just a disturbance, they were an act of war. The house was no longer a project to be finished, but a minefield he had to navigate. Every hammer blow was a risk, every power tool a provocation. He was no longer trying to fix the house, he was trying to survive it. Fear and frustration make for a toxic cocktail. After a sleepless night filled with the cacophony of enraged hisses and frantic clawing from the wall, David's frayed nerves finally snapped. He was standing in the upstairs hallway, a hammer in his hand, listening to the torment on the other side of the plaster. All his logic, all his careful planning had been rendered meaningless. He was being held hostage by a monster in his own family home. "Be quiet," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Just be quiet." He swung the hammer, not intending to break through, but just to strike back, to make a noise louder than the one that was driving him mad. The hammerhead struck the plasterboard with a dull thud. A web of cracks instantly radiated from the point of impact. From the largest crack, a puff of foul, cold air hissed out. It was an intensely sickening smell, a mix of freshly turned, damp earth, ammonia, and something else. something acrid and ancient. Before he could react, something shot out of the crack. It was long, thin, and the color of bone. It looked disturbingly like an insect's antenna or a crustacean's feeler, covered in fine dark hairs and segmented with chitinous-looking rings. It whipped through the air, probing, sensing, for a bare second before retracting back into the darkness with a wet, slurping sound. David stumbled back, dropping the hammer with a clatter. He stared, heart hammering against his ribs, at the dark crack in the wall. He had breached the nest. He had broken the most sacred rule. After that, everything changed. The direct, physical haunting subsided, replaced by something far more insidious. The creature began a psychological assault. His nightmares became vivid and suffocating. He dreamt he was trapped in dark, earthen tunnels, the weight of the world pressing in on him. He felt dirt in his mouth and the frantic, desperate sensation of scrabbling with his own hands against an impenetrable ceiling. He would wake up gasping for air, his sheets soaked in sweat. During the day, a persistent, crawling sensation plagued him. He would feel it on his arms, the back of his neck, the phantom touch of 1,000 tiny legs. He felt constantly watched, not by eyes, but by a blind, vibrational presence. He was a tuning fork, and the creature was listening to his every terrified thrum. The house, once his family's protector, now seemed to conspire with the distressed entity. It turned against him. Doors would jam, trapping him in rooms for minutes at a time, before inexplicably swinging open. The power would short out in whatever room he was in, plunging him into darkness. The worst came when a pipe under the kitchen sink, a pipe he himself had inspected and deemed sound, suddenly burst, flooding the newly finished floor with gallons of rusty water. The house was actively trying to drive him out, to reclaim its silence and solitude. The symbiosis was broken, and the house was siding with its oldest resident. David was a man besieged. He stopped all renovation, the silence of his inaction a screaming testament to his fear. He spent his days in a state of hypervigilance and his nights in terror. He knew he couldn't stay, but the thought of leaving, of handing this cursed property over to some unsuspecting family, was impossible. He was trapped not just by the creature, but by his own conscience. In desperation, he returned to his mother's journals, frantically searching for a solution, a forgotten rule, anything. He pored over the final volume, his mother's handwriting growing shakier in the last entries. And there, near the end, he found it, a passage detailing a time she, too, had angered the keeper. January 14th, 2019. I made a terrible mistake. The scratching had grown louder with my illness, a reflection of my own pained vibrations. I thought I could muffle it. I tried to insulate the hallway wall. The keeper reacted with fury. The humming in the floors was deafening. For a week, the house was a place of misery. It felt the attempt to silence it as an attack, an attempt to sever the connection. I remembered what my mother told me. She called it the lullaby. The creature is soothed by specific, rhythmic, low-frequency sounds. It is the opposite of the chaotic noise of destruction. It is the vibration of harmony. For her, it was the hum of her sewing machine. For me, I found a record. A collection of cello suites. The low, sonorous vibration of the cello suite number 1, it calmed the beast. The frantic scratching subsided, replaced by the old, familiar song. It is a fragile truce, but it is a truce. A surge of desperate hope shot through David. He remembered the old record player in the living room, a dusty turntable his mother had cherished. He scrambled downstairs, his heart pounding. He found the cabinet of vinyl records, his fingers flying through the sleeves until he found it, Bach, Cello Suites. With trembling hands, he placed the record on the turntable, cleaned the needle with the pad of his thumb, and lowered the arm. The speakers crackled to life, and then the music began. The deep, resonant, melancholy notes of the cello filled the house. It was a sound of profound, somber beauty. He walked to the bottom of the stairs and listened. Upstairs, the furious, hissing rage from within the wall continued for another minute, then two. But as the cello's low-frequency vibrations permeated the structure of the house, the creature's agitation slowly, perceptibly began to subside. The frantic clawing softened, the hissing faded, and finally, it was replaced by the original, calm, rhythmic scratch, scratch, scrape. The truce was temporarily restored. David sank onto the steps, the music washing over him, a wave of relief so profound it almost brought him to his knees. The house was calm. But as the final notes of the suite faded and the automatic arm lifted, a new, more terrifying realization dawned. The music was a solution, but it was also a chain. He couldn't sell the house. He couldn't just pack up and leave it empty. The pact was real. And he, David Harris, the man of logic and blueprints, had inherited it. The house needed a human heartbeat. It needed a keeper. To abandon it now would be a death sentence for the next inhabitants, who would move in with their loud children and their demolition plans, and who would never know the rules of the lullaby that kept the monster in the walls from tearing its way out. David was trapped. The realization settled not with a crash, but with a cold, quiet certainty. He could not live the rest of his life as a warden, a prisoner in his own inheritance, constantly playing music to placate a subterranean god. Yet he could not, in good conscience, unleash this horror upon an innocent family. He was an architect. He solved problems of structure and space, and this was the ultimate structural problem. If he couldn't get rid of it, he had to reinforce its prison. He had to renegotiate the pact. A new, incredibly dangerous plan began to form in his mind, a fusion of his own architectural knowledge and the strange lore gleaned from his mother's journals. The creature needed shelter. It needed to feel the companionship of the house's vibration. But it was also a biological entity. It likely needed to hunt or gather sustenance. His renovations had enraged it, but the initial breach had shown him something. It had an interest in the world outside its walls. His plan was a desperate gamble. He would open the sealed wall, he would confront the nesting chamber, and he would build a new, heavily reinforced wall. But this new wall would contain an offering, a small, secure, sound-dampened passage, like a reinforced animal run, leading from the nest chamber, through the eaves, and out into the woods behind the house. It would be a new way for the creature to exit and enter, a way to engage with the outside world that didn't involve tearing through the living room. It was a madman's gambit to renegotiate a treaty with a monster. The climax was a symphony of terror and construction. He set up the record player in the upstairs hallway, putting the cello suite on a continuous loop. The low, calming notes became the soundtrack to his fear. He laid out his tools with surgical precision: pry bars, a reciprocating saw, heavy-duty soundproofing insulation, acoustic caulk, and a prefabricated steel tunnel he'd welded together in the garage. With the lullaby playing, he took a deep breath and began the careful demolition of the wall his mother had forbidden him to touch. He pried away the plasterboard. The foul, cold air washed over him again, stronger this time. He peered into the darkness. The nest was a cavernous space between the outer roof and the inner attic frame, far larger than he'd imagined. And in the deep shadows, he saw it. It was just a partial glimpse, lit only by the oblique angle of his work light, but it was enough to steal the breath from his lungs. It was huge, pale, and multi-limbed, its body a grotesque fusion of smooth, bone-white chitin and something that looked like petrified wood. It was huddled in the far corner, a great, blind thing of earth and nightmare. It seemed to be curled around several large, strange, pulsating sacs that gleamed wetly in the faint light. The creature sensed him. Its blind head, a featureless lump of pale flesh, swiveled slowly in his direction. A low hiss escaped it, a sound that vibrated in his teeth, momentarily overpowering the cello. The lullaby was barely holding it in check. "It's okay," David whispered, his voice trembling, not knowing if it could understand or even hear him. "I'm fixing it. I'm making it better." He worked with a frantic, sweat-soaked terror. Every buzz of the saw, every hammer tap felt like a poke to a sleeping dragon. He could hear the creature's soft, wet movements just feet away in the darkness, the scrape of its limbs on the old wood. He measured, cut, and installed the new reinforced framework. He packed it with layers of sound-dampening rock wool. He fitted the steel tunnel into place, ensuring it was secure. All the while, the cello played on, a fragile thread of sanity in a world of impossible horror. Finally, he sealed the last piece of plasterboard into place, his hands working frantically to drive the screws home. He had done it. He finished the job, sinking the last screw as the final notes of the cello suite faded into silence. The record player clicked, the arm lifting. And then, nothing. The house fell completely, utterly silent. The absence of the scratching, of the music, of everything was more terrifying than the noise had been. David backed out of the attic space, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. He waited. He sat on the top step of the attic stairs for what felt like an eternity, listening to the frantic pounding of his own heart. Had he made a fatal mistake? Had he sealed it in, enraging it beyond any hope of appeasement? Was it about to tear through the brand new wall, through the entire house to get to him? For a full day, there was no sound. The silence was a crushing weight. He didn't eat. He barely moved. He just waited for the inevitable explosion of violence. Then, that night, as he sat in the bark living room, he heard it. A new sound. It was a soft, heavy shuffling from above. A scraping sound, not on plaster, but on metal. He followed the sound with his ears as it moved from the center of the attic towards the back of the house. It was the sound of the creature, his keeper, using the new passage he had built. He heard a final soft thud as it presumably exited the tunnel into the woods. And then, once again, silence. He didn't sleep, but he felt a sliver of hope. In the cool hours just before dawn, he heard the sounds again, in reverse. The shuffling in the tunnel, the soft thud of its return, and then silence. He waited all day, his nerves stretched to their breaking point. Had it worked? Had the pact been renegotiated? That evening, as he sat reading one of his mother's journals, he heard it. It was faint, muted by the new soundproofing, but it was unmistakable. Scratch, scratch, scrape. The calm, familiar, rhythmic song. It was back. The keeper was home, and it was content. The pact was renewed, on new terms. A slow smile spread across David's face, the first genuine smile in weeks. He hadn't just renovated a house, he had restored a relationship. He had looked into the abyss and built a bridge. He made a decision. He wasn't going to sell. He couldn't. This was his legacy, his duty. He would move in. He would be the new keeper of the house and its ancient, unseen residents. Months later, David was settled in. The house felt calm, protected. He'd painted the walls, refinished the floors, but this time he did it quietly, carefully, with the cello suites playing softly in the background. The rhythmic scratching was a nightly comfort, the sound of a sleeping guardian. He was on the phone with Chloe. "So you're really staying?" she asked, the surprise evident in her voice. "I thought you were desperate to sell." "The old place grew on me," David said simply, looking at the hallway wall, now painted a warm, comforting gray. "Well, I'm glad," she said. "But hey, did you ever figure out what that giant raccoon was in the wall?" David looked at the wall, where he could just barely perceive the faint, gentle rhythm of his companion. He smiled a little, a genuine, peaceful smile. "Yeah," he said, "we came to an arrangement." Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.